Hello everyone, welcome. Today I'm going to take issue with one of my favorite people. I always follow him on his YouTube channel. His name is Neil Oliver. He's everyone in England, he's Scottish, in the UK knows him. He's also on GB News, very successful YouTube channel, I believe. And he, at the moment, he's talking for the most part about politics and what is happening to our country and the world or the West. But he's different in that he addresses problems from, I would say, even a moral viewpoint. He has obviously a very deep-rooted sense of justice, and he deals with questions such as, you know, the citizens feeling abandoned or ignored by their politicians and their policies and so on. So I find myself follow him because he's worth listening to. And I find myself today for the very first time disagreeing with him. And I'm not comfortable disagreeing with him because he truly is very knowledgeable. A philosopher, a thinker. And I would even dare say that he has more of a moral acumen than I have. So I find myself a little bit uncomfortable. But in his going against him. But I hope, well, he doesn't know me. But anyway, if he ever hears of this post, which is unlikely, I just want to tell him, really, that I am disagreeing with him because I do feel that I have a sort of a moral obligation to do so. Because he's talking about something very famous event that took place in Spain, in the province of Valladolid, the first debate on human rights. And this is in 1550-51. Okay, so there are some misconceptions there that I always find within an English British culture, and so I have to take up issue with this. The first. Oh, by the way, his video, I will post it down below, okay, for you to watch it. It is called, the title of it is, "And They Want to Make Us Slaves," or something like that. So he goes on to the debate that took place in 1550 in Spain. All right, so the first misconception is, and the main one, is that he thinks that this debate, which was extremely important in Spain at that time, it was going to change the law of the Indies, that they were discussing about the human soul, or whether the Indians, the Western Occidental Indians, Western Indians, in other words, the people of the Americas at the time, had a soul or were fully human beings. And that was not the case at all. That was not what the debate was about. The Spain, or Catholic Spain, as the English called it in a rather deriding way, I suppose, in their minds. The Catholic Church has always believed that every human being has a soul and free will because of that soul. The discussion was never about whether the Indians were fully human beings. The Catholic Church accepts that everyone has a soul and everyone is 100% a human being. That was a discussion that North Americans would have centuries later as to whether the slaves were 100% human beings or 3/4 of a human being. That was a debate that was not held in Spain. Both debaters, and I'm going to introduce them, agreed it was a given that everyone has a soul. That was not what the debate was about. The other not so important misconception is that Spain had colonies. Spain never had colonies. By colony in the English sense. Spain had provinces. The difference is, and this is like 100 years before Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia. Those places that Spain conquered were considered provinces in the sense that they were integral part of the mainland. In other words, if it was today, they would be able to vote on a Spanish election in Spain. In fact, Spain has two places right now, tiny little places in the territories in North Africa, Ceuta and Melilla, and they vote in Spanish elections. In other words, they are not separated from, as Gibraltar is, for example, from England. Gibraltar does not vote in English elections. Ceuta and Melilla do. There was a difference there. In other words, they were the same as every other Spaniard. Okay. That's another one. The third one, misconception, is that Spain had slaves. Spain never had slaves. Portugal had slaves, and later England had slaves. Spain never had slaves, first because it was contrary. Then I will explain this in detail, but just let me state the obvious. It was totally against the Catholic faith to have slaves. But also Spain never really went to Africa as such. Spain went to the Americas, and the problems were different. So what the debate is going to be about is this. There are two main debaters here. One is a doctor of jurisprudence, theology, a very learned man who had published already many books. I will introduce him. Sepulveda. And the other one was Las Casas. That was his surname. He was a bishop. He had already been bishop in the New World, in Chiapas, in Mexico, and so on. And he was now back in Spain. And he's the one known for bringing to the attention of the king and of Spain the abuses that the Indians were suffering. They called them at the time Indians, Occidental Indians. The abuses that they were suffering at the hands of the conquistadors. He was the one, in other words, it was the church who brought this to the attention of the world and how wrong it was and so on. So the initial debate was going to be, first of all, about whether, even to begin with, before you start arguing and debating about anything, whether Spain, a country in Europe, had the right to go and conquer lands. We know what the answer is today. But remember that in the olden times, following the Roman Empire, it was natural, it was considered natural. It doesn't mean that it is right, but it was considered natural at the time for countries to go and explore unconquered lands. It was, actually, it was applauded. Remember the Romans? Yes, they were made heroes. So at that time, it was not considered something wrong to go out and conquer lands. That would change eventually. So the British Empire was completely different to the Spanish Empire because things had changed, and Westphalia and many other things, and so the British Empire was about trade, yeah. But the Spanish Empire, sort of 300 years before, it was about conquering lands. They didn't think that conquering lands for your emperor or whatever was anything wrong. So the mindset is a little bit different. So this is almost the first time that they're asking, is this right? Very important question. It would change the history of the world, perhaps. And if it is right, let us assume Las Casas would not agree. He was going to argue against it. But even if it were right, was it right to try to convert them to the Christian faith? Why would that be so? So there were many questions here that I'm going to deal with them in detail and try to introduce them to you, okay? But it was never about whether an Indian, a Native American was a full human being. That was not the question, and this is extremely important. So let me go here to some of my notes because I want to introduce you to the cast. I'm going to give you just 1 or 2 paragraphs of their CVs, their resumes, so that you know. And this, I don't know that I said this, it was a major debate in which the University of Salamanca and then the University of Alcalá in Madrid actually had their input, and it would change the law. Okay, so it was like the Kennedy-Nixon first television presidential debate, as it were, although its consequences were greater. So let me first of all introduce you to the 2 debaters here. And I'm going to just read a little, well, not read, but okay, so this debate took place in province in Valladolid, which was then the capital of Spain. It's in Castile, and it is called the Junta of Valladolid. Now, my friend Neil Oliver says, can you imagine a junta? That is a misunderstanding of the word. Junta in Spanish means a gathering, a meeting of people. I know that in English the word is associated with Latin American dictators, but the meaning is a group of people coming together, a board. Yeah. So these 2 debaters are going to discuss these huge issues before jurists and doctors and theologians and so on. And each one is going to bring their books, what they have written about it, as a means of starting the debate and the conversation. So it is this meeting, this debate takes place in Valladolid. It was held in the years 1550 and 1551. And there theologians and jurists debated the way in which the colonization of America of the Americas was being carried out, and the rights of indigenous people. So it is, in a way, considered the first debate on human rights in history. All right, so we are in the year 1550. Sepulveda. I wish I could write, perhaps I will write the names down so you can study and read more about it yourself. I would ask you, for questions like this, go beyond Wikipedia, because Wikipedia, in my opinion, is good to, if you say, where is France? They will tell you exactly where France is. But in questions that need a deeper discussion, be they political, theological, philosophical, remember that Wikipedia, anyone can write for Wikipedia, so you have to take everything really with a pinch of salt. So go deeper into, other readings. Okay, so I will put the names down below anyway, because I wish I had the technological knowledge to insert them as I'm talking, but I don't know how to do that, so I'll write them below. Anyway, Sepulveda studied at the University of Alcalá in Madrid. He was known for being an anti-Erasmist, against Erasmus. Okay. In 1515, he went to Bologna, where he received his doctorate in theology and law. Then he became a member of the Royal College of Spain in Bologna. Remember, when we're talking about Italy here, that Spain had territories in what is now Italy. It wasn't Italy then. Spain had Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Naples, Milan. By the way, Genoa, which is the place where Columbus is supposed to have been born, was not. He wasn't born in Genoa. He was born in a little town called Calvi in Corsica. Anyway, all right. So he became an anti-Erasmus. He translated Aristotle's Politics in 1548. Which some understand Aristotle to be defending the subjugation of inferior cultures, as he put it. In other words, he didn't see anything wrong with slavery as it was at the time. Okay, there. All right. So he was a translator of Aristotle. He also revised the Greek text of the New Testament, and he became the Emperor Charles I of Spain, Charles V of Germany, who appointed him his chronicler, his historian. Again, he opposed Erasmus of Rotterdam and his ideas on free will, and also refuted Martin Luther. He very much defended Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the Catholic monarchs, Isabella, Fernando. Catherine being the wife, the first wife of King Henry VIII of England. Anyway, so he has a long history and he has a long resume there. He was a scholar, so he had his points of view and he was going to debate them. The other debater was a bishop, Bartolome de LAS CASAS for short. his surname. He had written first of all from New Spain, from Mexico, about what was happening there, and then he came back to Spain, and as I said, he made it known about the abuses. And he's known as the defender of the Indians, the one who first brought it to everyone's attention. So, and all right, I'm just going to, okay. They had been, both men knew each other, and they were in disagreement already about different things, not only about the conquests, but about other different things, and each one was trying to have the other books censored, and so there was already a beef between these two gentlemen. Okay, so what is the controversy about? Sepulveda, being a philosopher and a jurist, is going to base his arguments on reason, on natural law, and on Christian theology to justify the Spanish conquest. He's the baddie. You're all going to disagree with him straight away, but let me introduce him to you. Okay. And he wrote this defense on one of his publications was Democritus' Altar. Okay, a dialogue of the just causes of the war or the conquest against the Indians. All right, what were his arguments? First, he's going to ask, is conquest of other lands justified or not? In those days, they thought it was. Number two, the right to the guardianship of the Indians. Are the conquerors entitled to preach the Christian faith to the indigenous people? Yes or no? Would this mean that if that is the case, would this mean submission of the original peoples to a new religion, to Christian doctrine, and therefore, by implication, to a Christian government? Big issue. He argued that he was not accepting, he was not in any way accepting servitude or slavery. He made that clear. All right, number three. But do the Christian conquerors have an obligation to prevent, even by force if need be, what the Spaniards encountered in Mexico and Peru and so on, the sacrificing of human beings and cannibalism? In other words, the sacrifice were eaten afterwards. And as he says, and other unnatural acts practiced by the indigenous people. Now we have another writer, I forget his name now, who had accompanied Cortés during the conquest of Mexico, and he stayed with him for a long time, and he wrote his autobiography, and he explains in great detail. He wasn't a scholar, he's just explaining in great detail what he saw. And with the conquest of Mexico, for example, he says that he's the one who tells us about, well, others, but his book is famous about, Cortés sort of burning the bridges or the ships and so on. So there you were. You had to fight, or that was it. You didn't have an alternative. And many other things that we know in history of what happened. But one of the things he mentions is that the Aztecs were the people, the tribe in command, in power. But there were many other tribes that were not Aztecs that hated the Aztecs because of the huge tributes that they demanded from the other peoples. And so it was easy for Cortés to befriend all these other tribes in order to move into Mexico City, what we now call Mexico City. But he explains in great detail how very far from the center one could smell blood. And it was because the sacrifices, the Aztecs would perform human sacrifices. The priests, I don't want to say the word because YouTube might bring me down. But anyway, they were sort of, we would say today, gay, engaged in a different sexual behavior, and they couldn't wash the blood out of their hands or their hair. They couldn't cut. They couldn't cut their hair either. Have the haircut. So they were actually full of blood that they couldn't wash. And he mentions the stench from very, very far off, the stench of this the smell of blood. But then they would also engage on what we now say cannibalism, the eating of human flesh. So this is what the Spaniards encountered there. And Sepulveda is going in this direction, saying, do they have a right to stop it or not? When you see something like this, are you morally obliged to stop it by fair means or foul or not? Or do you just say, oh no, this is their culture. Sorry, I can't do anything about it because it's nothing to do with me. That was the argument. Because the Christian faith, he's going to bring in that the Christian faith obligates you to do something about it when you see something being done that you consider wrong. To put it in today's terms, for example, you see, it might be easy for some, but it's not an easy question. In today's terms, if you see a man sexually abusing a child, okay, you know it's wrong. All right. Now, what do? Are you supposed to stop it and do everything you can to stop it? Or are you to say, no, it is nothing to do with me. It is, his conscience, or that's the way he is, and so let him be the way he is. Yeah. So in those days, they considered this, the sacrifice of human beings, as something that had to be stopped. And this is what Sepulveda is going to argue. By stopping these sacrifices and these, what he calls unnatural acts. You have to read between the lines. Okay. Number 4. Do the Christian conquerors, because of this, have the duty, therefore, to save future victims, innocent victims, he says, who would be sacrificed to false gods. He's asking this question, do they have a duty? Because by stopping it, you're also protecting what he calls, in his culture, obviously, innocent victims. He talks about the mandate of evangelization that Christ gave to the apostles and the Pope to kings, the church to kings. And so he's going to argue that it's not only bishops or the king that need to evangelize, but every Christian confronted with this has to act. Those are his points, okay? And then he's going to base all this on that question that St. Thomas Aquinas had already dealt with, and that is there such a thing as a just war? And in this case, a conquest that would also facilitate the preaching of the faith. Now, what he argues is that here are some people whose civil governance, and this is, I'm going to be careful because this is something that Las Casas is going to totally disagree with and actually pull down. But he's arguing, it reminds us now a little bit of Orientalism, that some people's civil governance are structured in such a way that puts them in an inferior position to defend themselves. And therefore, since they cannot defend themselves, they are more prone to be abused, and also they're more prone to obey others. Where is he going with this? In order to stop these sacrifices, he argues, if they refuse by peaceful means, then to stop it, and they're not going to because it is their religion, but he's arguing the point. If they refuse, then is it lawful for Christians to subdue them by force of arms? This is going to be difficult, by force of arms. Then he defines very clearly, because he's accused of calling them barbarians, and he's going to define his terms. And he says, first of all, there are very many definitions of barbarians, and he didn't mean it in his writings as being inferior peoples. He goes back to Aristotle and he says, for example, people who are, quoting Aristotle, barbarians in its proper sense, in other words, they are cruel and they are inhuman, what Aristotle called beasts or brutes, people with no moral center. He wasn't saying that these were the Indians of America. He's going through many definitions. All right. Another definition of barbarians is how the Romans apply the word. In other words, people outside of the Roman Empire. So from the Germans northwards, they were barbarians, meaning strangers, foreigners, not within the civilized imperial Rome, as it were. So that's another definition of barbarians. Another definition of barbarians, going back to Aristotle, is those people who are also incapable of governing themselves because of mental or handicapped or congenital deficiency. In other words, in the sense of different, not vulnerable, not being able to defend themselves. Mm-hmm. And another definition that he has is meaning Gentiles or infidels, the people who do not believe. In other words, non-Christians. Those are the four definitions during his time of what barbarian meant. Now, he emphasizes this because in addition to his philosophical arguments, and those based on natural law, human sacrifices are against natural law, therefore they are anti-Christian, because anything that is against natural law goes against the doctrine of the Catholic faith. Hence now abortion and everything else. If it is against natural law, it is against the Catholic faith. So his philosophical arguments and those based on natural law, Sepulveda is also going to base his defense on biblical and theological and jurist legal arguments, following the interpretations of ancient medieval scholasticism, they were not always shared by all medieval thinkers in any case, but they were current in his time. So you could summarize them as follows. Or he summarizes them as follows. First, I'm summarizing, you can understand. Okay, so he says, first, the inhabitants of the Promised Land, Palestine, before the descendants of Abraham settled there, the Pentateuch, they were punished for having committed idolatry and human sacrifice. Okay. Number 2, he says, on biblical grounds, the words of God in the Gospel of St. Luke 14:23, compelle intrare, compel them to come in. According to the Vulgate, a phrase used also, it's a phrase also used by St. Augustine, as proof, he says, of the lawfulness of the use of force in matters of evangelization. Words, he said, to be understood also in terms of physical and body compulsion. Las Casas is going to argue that this is a misinterpretation of St. Augustine's words. What does St. Luke's what are his words? This is from St. Luke 14:23. And the Lord said to the servant, go into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. There is, it's just a little verse. It's, you can go before and after, and he continues with the argument. But, all right. Las Casas is going to say that this is a misreading and a misinterpretation. Number 3. Sepulveda says that, for example, Pope Saint Sylvester, when he baptized Constantine, urged him to punish idolatry with loss of property and perhaps even the death penalty. I don't know about this. I don't know history or canon law. Number 4. Also, the words of St. Paul in the first epistle to the Corinthians. It's a long... you would find it kind of in chapters 12, 13, 14. He says these words are to be interpreted as the power or the obligation of the church to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, to the unbelievers, infidels as they were called at the time, subordinating all things temporal to things spiritual. Number 5, these are his arguments. The power and authority and obligation that Christ transmitted to Saint Peter and his successors, that also extends to the faithful. Go and preach the gospel. Go and evangelize. Number 6, canon law states that the Gentiles can be punished not just for being idolaters, but also for those engaging in acts against natural law. 7. Therefore, he says, the Indians were indeed barbarians, as they did not live according to natural reason or natural law, and had many customs publicly approved amongst themselves, but certainly contrary to natural law. So he's asking Las Casas, okay, so you can defend their culture, but if it is against natural law, are you still willing to defend it? But of course it gets more complicated. Number 8. Therefore, although combating these beliefs may go contrary to Indian customs and Indian culture and cause offense to them, war against these practices must not cease to be done, he says. And at the same time, it will prepare the ground for Christian teaching. Stop it first and then you preach. For Christian teaching, which is the duty left, he says, not only, and the obligation not only to peace-loving missionaries and those who lead exemplary lives. Little nudge there to Las Casas. Number 9. The church has been commanded to preach the gospel throughout the whole world and consequently has the authority to do so. 10. It is not true that these battles, when trying to stop these practices, bring about or create greater evils than their idolatrous practices and their human sacrifices. He says, we know that in New Spain, in Mexico, for example, more than 20,000 innocent people were sacrificed every year. 11. In the Pontifical of 1493, Pope Alexander VI, he says, explicitly authorizes the Catholic monarchs of Spain to dominion over the lands conquered and their inhabitants, that after the political conquest there may follow and be always facilitated the preaching of the gospel. So, Sepulveda insists on this pontifical authorization, very important at the time, to combat serious crimes against natural law, affirming that the Pope's power although it applies properly to those things that belong to the salvation of souls and to things spiritual, nevertheless, things temporal are subject to things spiritual, and therefore the Church can compel nations to stop or to safeguard their inhabitants against crimes against natural law. In all of this, Sepulveda was clear, and he emphasized throughout the debate that, of course, the Church could not force anyone to embrace the Catholic faith. First of all, because it doesn't make sense. Violence in this respect, to begin with, would be useless. You cannot force anyone to believe if he doesn't want to. So this is illogical and this is useless, but that is not his point. His point is, I accept that you cannot force people to believe. That is denying them their soul, that is denying them their free will. So obviously you have to, in preaching, you have to use persuasion and you have to persuade, and then you have to convince the Gentiles, the unbelievers, or the barbarians, by rational means. So, given this, he asked, and this was the question, is it licit for the Spaniards to, first of all, to occupy their lands and provinces of the Indians, and to establish new lords and depose the old ones? That was the question. He tried to answer these questions with the University of Salamanca had put there for people to answer, as it were. It was a debate. It was an ongoing debate. Now, as you can see, they were not denying whether the Indians had a soul or not. That was not it. Okay, so the arguments of the other debater, Las Casas. He says that, first of all, Sepulveda falsified the doctrine of Aristotle by including as barbarians those of mental or congenital incompetence, which Aristotle in any case had always supposed to be of, quotes, small number. So, he says, this cannot be applied to the Western Indians, who were many. They were all of them. To be fair, Sepulveda never emphasized this point, however, nor did he base his arguments on this point of people, handicapped people. I mean, he was just going through the very many definitions of what barbarians might mean, but he never based any of his arguments on this. So Las Casas is a little bit off here. But anyway, he's going to make great points, so don't worry about it. Okay. In addition, he says, nature, quotes, tend to beget the best. Centuries later, it would be perhaps the survival of the fittest or something equivalent. But so nature tends always to beget the best. So in this respect, it would be inappropriate, he argues, to define a whole race or nation in this way. As I said, Sepulveda had never based his arguments on this, but in any case, he makes his point. But Las Casas was going to base his objections. I'm sorry, that was the telephone, right in the middle of it. Okay, but Las Casas was going to base his objections more on morality than on philosophy. or even natural law. He said, he was a good debater, I prefer the gospel to Aristotle, and therefore proposed that such barbarians, if you want to call them that, should be by all means attracted to the gospel, but always by peaceful means. For Sepulveda, he argued, for you, whether he was understanding him or misunderstanding him, whatever, but his argument was, for you, Sepulveda, the Indians were in a state of backwardness that required tutelage, that required guidance. In fact, Las Casas argue, they may even be more advanced than European Christians. Have you seen their architecture? I don't see anything inferior about that. Do you? Why do you assume that they are backward? Good question. Because they are different, because they have these different sacrifices, because they are politically structured in different ways. Why would you consider and assume that they're more backward than European Christians? Question number one. Then he says, you, Sepulveda, consider an attack against nature, against the Lord of nature, to eat human flesh, okay, which is an unjust idolatry. But Las Casas added that in order to punish these evils, and he agreed that it wasn't a very good thing, but in order to punish them or to stop them, you need legal jurisdiction over these people of the Occidental Indians, the Native Americans. And the kings of Castile do not have this jurisdiction, for the natives of these lands were not subject to the kings of Castile. Therefore, you have no power to stop something that, the people were not subjects of the kings of Castile. So who are you to come and tell them what to do? You have no jurisdiction. He argued these were free peoples. Therefore, and consequently, they are free and they are the absolute owners of their lands. So they can do with their customs or whatever they want. But he concedes that punishment could be applied to heretics. That means Christians who left the faith or are fighting against it. But that is not the case in the inhabitants of this land. They were not Christians. They had never heard of anything Christians. They're not they were not heretics. Therefore, you cannot. They're not necessarily going against the Christian faith in their minds. Now, Sepulveda had defended arms intervention, military intervention, to protect non-idolaters of those lands, and hence to avoid, the actual word is anthropophagy, the eating of human flesh by human beings, and the immolation of victims. That was Sepulveda. Now, Las Casas agrees that such judgment, agrees with those judgment, but It is of the opinion that in such cases, those crimes are not crimes in this particular case that justify the use of war. And then he says, oh, and Sepulveda, you like quoting the Bible? Well, let me tell you about the Bible. Immolation of human victims for religious reasons. Okay, let's quote the Bible. Abraham and Isaac, the boy Isaac, carrying his own wood to be sacrificed to God. When I read that, I thought, that's a good point. Yeah, because Isaac carrying the wood, signifying the Christ that was going to come later and the sacrifice on the cross. So yeah, Abraham was going to sacrifice his son. Okay, who was a human being. And I thought, oh, okay. He makes a good point. But then I thought a little bit more about it, and I thought, no, hold on, because these are my thoughts, but the purpose of the intention of this, of Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice, is not just to make a human sacrifice to God. In other words, Abraham did not wake up that morning and say, I'm going to offer God a sacrifice, the best sacrifice that I can possibly offer, my son, my only son. That wasn't the point. The point was about faith and obedience. In fact, it was God who asked him to sacrifice his son. And so, if you, God, want me to do so, I will do so. So it was a question, it was testing faith and, not a test, but I'm not a theologian and I don't use the right words, but it was a question of faith and obedience. And so he was willing to, the point is that he was willing to obey God to the extent of sacrificing his own son. And as we know, God stopped him after he put the fire there and everything, stopped him, and then there was a lamb there. Yeah, the lamb that was to be Lamb of God, who was to be sacrificed. So it was about faith and obedience more than just sacrificing a human being. So I don't know where Las Casas was going with this, but anyway, that was what he mentioned, the Abraham and Isaac sacrifice. Then he agreed that the change of religion cannot be imposed by force, and one is obliged to offer to God what seems most important to them. For him, neither anthropophagy, cannibalism, nor the sacrifice of human victims constitute, for Las Casas, a just cause for waging war on the American Indians. He says, idolatrous worship is, of course, abominable. He agrees. But his point is, the Indians sacrifice human victims to divinities that they believe to be true. Idolatry was therefore best uprooted by preaching accompanied by good examples, he argued. His point was that how do you define idolatry? Okay, the difference between the true God and false gods. Okay, but to them, their gods were the true gods. How do you explain idolatry on their part? You can't, he argued. Sepulveda had justified the war against the unbelievers because he considered that it opened the way to preaching and facilitating the task of the missionaries, accepting the authority of St. Augustine, who in his mind, in his understanding, had authorized violent compulsion in the preaching of the gospel. But I think it is clear that he misread or misinterpreted St. Augustine's text. But Las Casas adds that St. Augustine was referring to heretics over whom the church had jurisdiction, not to pagans. And since the Indians were pagans, they were to be treated as non-believers. Infidels was the word. Gentiles, but not as heretics. So, what happened? They both argued their cases. And how did the junta, the board, rule in favor? Did they rule in favor of one or the other? Well, historically, it is not clear that the junta ruled in favor of either thesis. No decision is known. The argument continued. Each of the debaters considered that they had won the debate, and so the debate continued. Las Casas says that the judges judge the unjust conquest illicit, and Sepulveda was of the opinion that the judges had followed the canons, who considered as just the wars that Christians made against the infidels. Now, to complicate matters a little bit more, Las Casas had accepted the concept of a just war, not against the Indians of America, but yes, against the Turks and the Mohammedans, as they were called at that time, but not against the Western Indians. Now explain. Okay, what is the difference here? I'm thinking. The difference that I see is that, what is the difference? The difference, well, everything is different, but I mean, in order to, for against the Turks to be a just war and against the Indians to be unjust. The main difference, obviously, is that the Mohammedans had, is it a monotheistic religion? That's one difference. Or could it be, based on his previous arguments, that the Muslims, remember that all the north of Africa and the Middle East had been Christian before they were Muslim, and so it could be that Las Casas perhaps see them in his own way as heretics from the Christian religion. I don't know. It has to be something like that. The Indians of America, nevertheless, had never, ever come across anything like Christianity. They were totally separate. I think that's probably the difference that he's trying to make. According to most opinions, the jurists of the junta the legal minds declared themselves in favor of Sepulveda and the theologians in favor of Las Casas. However, there was no vote on the matter, and the reports were sent to King Emperor Charles I of Spain, V of Germany, who was at the time at war with the Protestant princes. This between 1546 and 1547. And the result was that the dominion of the Spaniards, already existing de facto, of Spaniards in the Indians, was allowed to continue, and it's going to get a little bit more complicated, having neither been approved or condemned. But what happened? Since there was no final ruling, the conquest in America were suspended then, for the time being, until the Marquis of Cañete, the Viceroy of Peru, requested permission to continue with the conquests. And the final ruling, published in Valladolid in May 15th, 1556, were the conquest would be reauthorized, as it were, but explicitly it was declared that, quotes, no harm or violence being inflicted on the indigenous people. With that caveat. Okay. You can say that Las Casas really, it was his arguments that gain at least a moral victory. But then he continued writing and writing and writing, adding more numbers to more numbers, and eventually it was seen that his original stand and his original papers and his original book, everyone accepted, but then he continued to add more and more and more and more. And so the question was, can we see this now, all these addenda, as history or as him trying to continue to make his point? Because there were clearly a lot of exaggerations by the time he finished with it. But anyway. But the main point is that at the end he went beyond and he tried to affirm the right of property, the civil power of all peoples, and the way he put it was actually defying Spanish dominion there by emphasizing the autonomy of all peoples. So we are back again to the same argument. Sepulveda was thus defender of the rights, to put it very simply, the rights of conquest and colonization under certain conditions, and because of certain reasons to do also with natural law. And Las Casas was defending Christian universalism, yes, as well as Sepulveda, but by peaceful means alone and by persuasion. But throughout the whole debate, no one denied the soul and the free will of an Indian, and none of them denied their rational capacity or their inferiority as human beings. That was not the question. Sepulveda was arguing that their self-government, with their customs, had nevertheless to be fought and eradicated, while Las Casas placed his moral arguments on the full dignity and, if you want, inalienable rights of the Indian to their faith and their customs. And Sepulveda was saying, even if they go against natural law, so the question is, okay, there is so much more to tell you about it. Gosh, I have a lot of info here, but I think that you might start to get tired of it. Anyway, the whole thing is that the law was changed. The law was changed in that eventually King Philip II made it very clear. Perhaps I will do a part 2 to this because there is a lot of info. But I will just advance this, that the law was changed. And so Philip II of the Armada stopped the conquest first and the evangelization later. What he said is that the political or military conquest had to stop. What he allowed was only for priests to go forward and evangelize the Indians. You might wonder, have you ever heard of Junípero Serra? He was from Mallorca. Later, much later, he evangelized the whole of California. If you go there, you see the missions. The idea was to first of all evangelize and teach. So Junípero Serra, he would stop and erect a church and a school. And the distance between the different churches and schools in different towns would be 1 day on horseback riding. Okay, so you have from you start with, well, obviously Mexico, and then what now is the United States. You start with San Diego and Los Angeles and Santa Monica, San Luis, all the names of the saints, all the way to San Francisco. That was Junípero Serra building a church and a school, evangelizing the Indians. They got as far as, Montana, which is montaña in Spanish, mountain. Colorado, which means red, or reddish. Of course, Florida on the other side, that is Florida, Pascua, Florida, the day of the Pasch, Resurrection Day, Easter Sunday, and so on. And then, of course, Texas and so on was part of Mexico. But in other words, this debate actually, I will tell you more about it, how the law was changed and what happened and didn't happen. But Junípero Serra is in Congress. Each state has 2 statutes about the 2 founders or the 2 great men from that one particular state. And from California, one is of Junípero Serra. I don't know whether it was there when I was there in the 80s and 90s. I don't know whether the statue has been pulled down. But anyway, it was one of those. So the actual military conquest was stopped by, you might say, obviously the king, but by the Catholic Church, as it were. I'll tell you more about it today because I think I don't know how long I have been speaking. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that it has been of interest. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.